There's been a lot of talk about netcode in the FTC recently, and for good reason. As the scene continues to grow and more fighting games are released, players need every opportunity to help sharpen their skills as well as keep their game's communities active. And when conditions line up perfectly, online can be great. Tech can be shared, matchups can be learned, fun can be had. But when online is bad, well, you get the point. During an interview for an upcoming documentary on Killer Instinct, I had a chance to talk to Keits about netcode and just what goes into its different flavors and the benefits of properly implementing rollback systems.
Netcode's the most important factor in a fighting game because the players who play online need to find a match quickly, and that match has to be stable, and it needs to feel as offline as possible. And fortunately for us, this problem was basically solved in 2007-ish by Tony Cannon with GGPO. So we've had a framework to look at for how to approach this problem and do it in a really satisfactory way. But I think the thing that most people don't think about with having good netcode is actually matchmaking. It's not just a factor of, can I find a match that has a low enough ping or that has close to my rank, right? When you have really good netcode that can roll back, you're expanding the search. The maximum tolerable ping probably for most people in delay-based netcode is around 60 to 80. Anything above that, and it's just unplayable garbage. If there's any packet loss at all, it's unplayable garbage. With rollback, you actually expand that. Now you can play people at 150 ping, and it feels like offline. And you can play people at 200 ping with some visual artifacts that are weird, but it feels like offline. And suddenly my matchmaking sphere isn't the two states next to my state, it's actually most of the globe. There's a website where you can ping any place to any other place. You'd be shocked. It's very hard to find anything that goes over 150. You can find stuff that gets into over 200 from, if you're really the other side of the world, but like Orlando to London, that's actually probably not over 150. So if you can suddenly support that, now, when I'm matchmaking, I can care more about the rank of my opponent instead of just, is this connection going to be tolerable? And when you can do that, that means players who are weaker or newer are fighting more players who are also weaker or newer rather than getting bullied out of the game. And when they lose, they're waiting less time for their next match because maybe the same amount of people are playing KI as Street Fighter, but when Street Fighter is looking for a match for you, it has to start with a tight circle of low pings. And then it has to widen that as it fails. Whereas KI can just say, 150 is fine, let's go wide. Let's find you a good rank match instead of a good ping match first. So that's step one, right? Now suddenly a lot more people are having a lot more fun just because they're getting the right opponents. And we all know this, like in our hearts, all of us hardcore fighting game players, we know that having the right opponents is a key ingredient to addiction to this genre. It absolutely is. You have to play people around your skill level so that you can learn with them. Very few people have what it takes to sit down as a new player against someone like me or a Jay Wong or anyone experienced and tolerate that ass beating for long enough to climb through. That's just a really small number of people. You have to solve that problem, and the way you do that is Rollback Netcode. Rollback Netcode also solves a lot of other problems, which you can see when you hop online. You play somebody from Europe, yeah, there's occasional visual artifacts or whatever, but it feels like offline, and the reason it feels like offline is because the game doesn't wait for the opponent's inputs. So in delay-based netcode, you're going to need to have both your inputs, which you have as soon as you press them, and your opponent's inputs in order to go to the next frame. Let's say your ping is 90 to your opponent in delay-based netcode. That's round trip, ping times round trip, right? So we're looking at one frame being 16.6 milliseconds. It's roughly going to be a 6-frame round trip. So we already have my inputs. I don't have to send those and wait for them to come back. I need to wait for my opponent's inputs. So that's going to be about 3 frames. So if you have about a 90 ping and conditions are good, you could play a delay-based netcode game like Guilty Gear with 3-frame delay. That's pretty okay, right? That's not the worst. The problem is that because you have to wait for their information to come, what happens when the ping changes? And we all know it's not stable. It's 90, sometimes it's 80, sometimes it spikes to 120. Now the delay has to change dynamically. So the implication of that is that, oh, I'm getting used to the timing of being 3 frames behind. Shoot, now suddenly it's 5 frames behind for a few seconds and I've missed what I needed to hit. Oh, now it's back to 3, okay, right? And some games display that in real time at the top, other games hide it from you. And then you get into real trouble when you drop packets. What if the information doesn't come at all? And of course the game is going to bundle the next frame of inputs with the previous few frames in case that happened, so it can figure it out. But in delay-based netcode, the game's over when you don't have the opponent's inputs. We cannot go to the next frame, so the game just stops. And you've seen it, we've all seen it. The game just stutters, and it chunks out, right? The whole thing just freezes and stops, and it can't even take your inputs during those frames. So if you happen to be in the middle of like a quarter circle or a dragon punch, when it freezes, you might miss that direction entirely and you don't get your move, right? And people will call that eating inputs. And then you eventually get your opponent's data, and it does its thing to catch back up or whatever, but it just feels like garbage. The delay is changing, the game is stuttering. You need to have really ideal connections to play with people who are strictly wired, no Wi-Fi, people who are under 90 ping, very specifically. It's the only way you're gonna have a decent match with people. And you introduce the idea of rollback netcode. And how rollback netcode works is that we never wait for the next frame. We still have our delay of, let's say, 2 or 3 frames, whatever the developer thinks is right. So we're still gonna wait 3 frames just to wait for things to get to us. So let's say we're at 90 ping in rollback netcode. 3 frames later, my inputs are gonna play because we have that delay of 3. And I've got your inputs now, it's gonna play. It's just like delay-based netcode. It's literally identical. Rollback is delay-based netcode, but it's got more features. So what happens when I don't get your input or the delay changes? That's what rollback does differently. Instead of stopping and waiting for your inputs, what rollback does is it says, I have my local inputs, I'm going to the next frame. I don't care. I'm gonna predict what my opponent was doing. And all we do for that prediction is we just replay whatever was happening on the last frame. If they're holding forward, it's a pretty safe assumption that they're probably gonna continue to hold forward. Maybe they stopped, maybe they didn't, but we're gonna pretend they did. But in most cases, I would say 80% of the time in a fighting game, you're in a committed action. You've already jumped. There's nothing you can input to change that. You're already in a Fierce Punch. That's the next 45 frames of your life, is you doing that Fierce Punch animation. Nothing can change that. So if that hiccup happens to happen during that time, literally no visual artifacting can happen. It'll be exactly what the game thought it would be. But in the odd cases where somebody was walking forward, we thought they would continue to walk forward, but they actually jumped or they actually hit a button. We're gonna get their inputs a few frames later because they dropped them or because the ping went up. And then the game is going to be able to look at the game state, rewind a few frames to where we didn't have the inputs and say, did this match? Did what we get match exactly what we guessed? And if it didn't, it resimulates the game state in one frame back up to the current frame, totally invisible to the player, and then just renders the next frame normally. So in most cases, this will be like an invisible kind of correction. I'll do like a little posing here, and for a punch, right? You'll have anticipation poses. Your character, let's do like a Jago overhead. He puts his hand up here almost instantly. And he holds up here for like 3-4 frames before he starts to chop downwards. Say we have to roll back because we didn't get that input, and then we have to resimulate up. So we missed the first 2 frames of it. So instead of him going up here for 4 frames and then chopping down, he goes up here for 2 frames and then he chops down. That's invisible to the naked eye. No one will notice that that happened. Some things you will notice is if a character we expected to walk forward suddenly goes backwards and their walk speed is really high, you'll see them, instead of smoothly going like this, you'll see them kind of jerk and pop to the other side, right? But if your rollback is built correctly, it's very hard to see those types of things happen. They almost never happen at 90 milliseconds. You'll see them a tiny bit more, but they're hidden pretty well at 150 ping. At 200 ping, you'll see some visual artifacts, but you'll always feel the same. Your end is always 3 frames. Your combos always work the same. Your reaction time is always the same. You never have to adjust and say, well, I need to DP 6 frames later than I normally do, or 6 frames earlier than I normally do, because this guy jumped and the delay keeps fluctuating. You can actually learn the offline version of the game online because of rollback netcode. And it's an old technology, and it's not a particularly complicated technology. It's just a matter of developers saying, yes, this is valuable to us and we want to do this. and getting the message out there to say, look what this did for Killer Instinct. It has a thriving scene, after development has even stopped. People are finding matches lightning fast in this game. They can play people all across the world. Like, this is magic. You have to do this.
If you talk to any fan about Killer Instinct, one of the things they'll rave about is the game's netcode, and rightfully so. Even playing today, 6 years after the game's release, matches are found quickly, and playing the game online feels very much like playing locally. So what's going on under the hood to keep the intense pace of KI the same, even when playing online?
Basically, the gameplay logic is decoupled from the rendering. So we don't, do gameplay logic and render in kind of the same thing. The gameplay logic can happen without the need to render a frame. The game is always in the gameplay logic. The game can run with the monitor turned off and never render anything, and it still all happens, you just can't see it happening. So think of it like that. There's a version running with the TV turned off underneath, and then when we get to a new frame that we all agree is the correct frame to render, then we render it. And that'll mean if we go to the next frame and we have both players' inputs, just render it. If we go to the next frame and we don't have the opponent's inputs, then we make our guess and we render that. And then if we go to the next frame and we got your inputs and our guess was incorrect, now we go back a few frames, but we're not rendering. And then we resimulate, we don't render, we resimulate, we don't render, we resimulate, we're to the new frame now, and then we render. And the player never misses a beat there, it just goes to the next frame. But underneath, it rewinds and it gets us back up to current with proper gameplay logic and just gives us the new state of the game visually.
Earlier this year, Tony Cannon made an announcement that GGPO would become free to use under an MIT license. Now anyone could apply the Rollback SDK in commercial or non-commercial projects, which begs the question, could you just throw GGPO into a current fighting game and get solid rollback netcode, or is it more complicated than that?
You don't have to design for rollback from the get-go. You can retrofit it. NetherRealm proved this. They retrofitted it into a very old engine, and they did a great version of it too. There's a GDC talk about this as well, where NetherRealm painstakingly goes through how many people and how many months it took to retrofit this into their games. But the important ingredients are already in most fighting games. Fighting games have to be deterministic, so that when you put in the same inputs, you get the same result. There can't be any variation there at all. Pretty much every fighting game on the planet is deterministic, and we know this because they all have replay systems. And those replay systems are not videos, they're input files. They're just replaying our inputs back to us, and because those will always result in the same game state, we get to watch a perfect replay of our match and take control of the camera and do all the cool things we love to do in our replay modes, right? And frame step and all that neat stuff. So we know they're all deterministic already. What they really need to do is decouple the gameplay logic from rendering the next frame. That's the next big step. And then there are other steps in there to deal with problems you don't have to think about in delay-based. Let's do audio, for instance. If I do a fireball and Ryu yells, Hadouken! Hadouken! Cool. And then we're in delay-based netcode. I do the fireball. It drops a frame, stutters, but it gets to the frame where he's supposed to say Hadouken. Hadouken! Okay, we're still good, right? It's a little stuttery and weird, but it's fine. In rollbacks, let's say I'm throwing a fireball and I get to the frame where I say Hadouken and I yell Hadouken, but actually we just got the opponent's inputs and he jabbed me out of it. So now I actually didn't throw a fireball. That was incorrect. We have to roll back the game state, come back up a few frames. I'm in hit stun now. I'm not throwing a fireball anymore. The fireball wasn't ever real. I never got to the frame where I yell Hadouken. I was only like almost there. But my character's still gonna yell Hadouken. Hadouken! Yeah, he already started yelling it on my screen. Now we need new logic to cut that audio off. So he goes, Haba! And then slice it off, go into hit stun. But if you don't build that stuff, then you will see, like Street Fighter Cross Tekken had this, lots of audio artifacts. He'll yell Hadouken as if he threw it, but he never made it to that frame in, the resolved version of the game. And now you need a bunch of new code to handle all these things. VFX are the same issue. You'll see VFX play twice or, be there when they shouldn't be there.
Didn't hurt. KO! I don't understand!
So there's a lot of considerations you have to make when you convert over to a rollback system. It is not free. You cannot plug and play GGPO. It's a great framework for network stuff, but you still have to do things on your end to prep for it and to make sure it's still all smooth and good. So it's definitely not trivial. But I think what I want developers to understand is that you will have to spend money on netcode either way. You're either gonna do the bad netcode and spend money on it, or you're gonna do the good netcode and you're gonna spend money on it. And yes, the good netcode's gonna cost a little bit more money, but it's not like a choice between spending no money and a bunch of money. It's a choice between spending a bunch of money and a bunch plus a little bit more money. So I hope developers will seriously consider using this framework, whether they write it themselves or use GGPO, which just went free license.
I'm afraid your path ends here.
Outside of some major studios and indie developers, most fighting games today are still made in Japan, a much smaller country with a much better internet infrastructure. They still use delay-based netcode, which may work fine for Japan, but is definitely not as consistent in other parts of the world. When asked why these developers still choose to use delay-based netcode years after a game like Killer Instinct proved just how good Rollback could be, Keits had this to say.
It's hard to speak for other studios, but you see fighting games made in the United States have almost all entirely converted to Rollback. Almost every indie game made here also uses Rollback. It's definitely not a cost factor that's stopping people from doing this. I think there also might be a business factor where they say, listen, the netcode we have, this really works well for Japan. And you know what, the audience in the United States, they're buying it anyway. They're complaining about it, but they're buying it anyway. So why would we spend the extra to do this? There's the legacy factor too, where it's not like they're making a brand new game engine when they make the next Under Night game. It's the next version of Under Night. So this is an existing engine that has working netcode already. That's done. Now you're talking about redoing huge aspects of the game just to get this new netcode working. So I think it's certainly a lot easier and cheaper of a question when you're starting from scratch and you're like, not only is this a new game, but this is a new engine, then you can really make those decisions. But I think part of the problem with a lot of the games coming out of Japan specifically is they are reusing the same engine over and over again. And they just, because the sales are still so strong all over the world, they don't really see a business need to revamp that at the end of it. And maybe they have it in their brain that when we finally move to a brand new engine, maybe we'll do this. Maybe they won't though. And that's what scares me. And until then, we've had a decade of games that don't have rollback. And then we've had versions of rollback that have come out that are, kind of poisoning the well a little bit, making people think, oh, rollback is super teleporty and bad, because those have been kind of weaker implementations or broken implementations of rollback that never got fixed. But it's not like that. When rollback is well done, you need only play Skullgirls or KI or Mortal Kombat or Injustice or any of the great indie fighters that have this Pocket Rumble or Punch Planet. You need to only play those for a while to see that those misgivings are misplaced and that we could have a better future together.
Thank you for watching our talk with Keits on netcode and fighting games. As mentioned before, this is part of a much larger documentary on Killer Instinct that'll be out early next year, all made possible by our patrons, like these guys. So if you like what you saw and want to help us make more, consider becoming a patron today at patreon.com/holdbacktoblock. Till next time.